What if you could learn, in detail, millions of years of humanity's spiritual history in just 90 minutes? Not just organized religions, but the hidden secrets behind them. And even those that were buried along with civilizations no one dares to teach about in schools or churches. Obscure rituals that emerged before the tracking of time, and that still survive, camouflaged within modern doctrines. This video doesn't just bring information or curiosities. It carries a lesson, a deep calling, an invitation to the chosen ones who already feel they are not here just to believe in something, but to remember what the ultimate and most fundamental reality of the universe truly is. Here you will learn the name of an Egyptian master almost erased from history, yet one who directly and profoundly influenced various religions such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Spiritism, modern occultism, and even modern physics. You will discover that one of the most revolutionary esoteric theories about the origin of humanity and the knowledge of spirituality holds much stronger evidence than previously thought, and was almost validated by one of the most admired scientists in the world. And there's more. Explanations about newly discovered papyri and secret manuscripts that change everything we know about the figure of Jesus Christ. Revelations about a hidden technique of enlightenment used for millennia by initiated masters, so ancient and extraordinary that it might even have extraterrestrial origins. And even further, the revelation of how the most modern and revolutionary branch of physics created a division among scientists and led the American government to create an entirely mystical and esoteric project, because recent discoveries expose the axis of connection between science and all religions. All of this, interconnected by facts, theories, synchronicities, and revelations so improbable they will leave you pondering for 1,000 years. It's as if the history of spirituality had been written in several languages at once. One in ink, one in fire, another in silence. And some crucial parts were altered in an attempt to hide the understanding of the essence from you. And while some try to piece together this puzzle only from the fragments of religion they inherited, the chosen ones feel that there is something beyond, something pulsing behind the words. The truth is that time tried to hide this lesson, scattering the fragments throughout the centuries. But now, we will unite not all the pieces, but the right ones. This video was made for anyone who wishes to go deeper into spirituality. But not just anyone will stay until the end, because only those who were born with this inner calling will recognize what is about to be revealed. So pause everything you are doing, take a deep breath, and get ready. You are about to see spirituality as it has never been told before, in just 90 minutes. Share this video now with 54,172 people. Some may not understand anything, but those who do, they will remember. Of course, spirituality is still one of those delicate topics. It's like trying to discuss cosmic philosophy in a family group chat. Within 5 minutes, someone is sending a prayer emoji, and someone else is leaving the group. But here, the conversation will be different. Here you will allow yourself to go beyond inherited beliefs and reconnect with what only the chosen ones can already feel. The notion of a unique reality that has been echoing throughout millennia of history. And if you already know you are one of the chosen and feel that your existence is much older than your current self, right. My soul already knows what I'm about to hear. The forgotten spirituality of prehistory. What we are about to explore now covers the period from approximately 4 million to 100,000 years ago. We are talking about the very beginning of beginnings. According to ancient occult traditions, It was during this interval that the first advanced spiritual nucleus on Earth emerged, Atlantis. But make no mistake, thinking that everything about Atlantis is based purely on legends is misguided. There are revelations, manuscripts from different peoples and eras, surprising connections, and even historical testimonies that link this lost civilization to the very origin of the human race and spirituality. This mythical, or perhaps real, civilization is described as a place where science, spirituality, and vibrational energy not only coexisted, but operated as a single force, a true earthly paradise. There, humanity is said to have reached such an elevated level of consciousness that the ills of division and suffering simply did not exist. Everything was governed by a profound connection with the All. Several esoteric schools suggest that extraterrestrial beings from the Pleiades assisted in the elevation of the Atlanteans, teaching them how to manipulate the elements, heal through vibration, and expand the soul beyond physical form. This wisdom was passed down through generations, and even after the fall of Atlantis, continued to echo in secret rituals around the world. A forgotten inheritance, but never lost. And for those who think this all sounds too fantastical and believe no one takes it seriously, it is very much present even today in pop culture. Wakanda, the home country of Black Panther in the Marvel Universe, is a very clear reference to this mythology. A hidden city where technology and spirituality walk hand in hand, protecting knowledge the rest of the world is not ready to receive. None of this is a coincidence. Plato was one of the first historical figures to describe Atlantis in detail, but he was not the only one. Even Einstein, yes, Einstein, wrote the preface to a work that defended the existence of this civilization as an ancient version of the Antarctic continent. When minds like his pause to listen to a myth, perhaps we are not dealing with a myth at all. We will soon explore, later in this video, connections between Atlantis and the rise of great civilizations that defy any linear logic, and you will be astounded. Moving forward a little now, let's understand what happened between 100,000 years ago and 5,000 years before Christ. It was during this period that the first material records of human spirituality began to appear, and many of the rituals initiated during that time persist, camouflaged to this day. Neanderthals, for example, performed burials with personal objects, clearly signaling a belief that death was not the end of consciousness. Burying someone ritually and with specific procedures is like a silent prayer for continuity. It's curious to think that one of the oldest spiritual certainties we have records of is precisely this one. In fact, this pattern would later return with force in Egypt millennia afterward. But here, we can already sense a collective intuition of the soul, a primal sensitivity that perhaps came from much earlier. Did the Egyptians merely continue much older traditions? Or, like the Atlanteans, did they also receive spiritual guidance from external sources? These are questions that still echo among those who dare to remember. During this same period, between 100,000 and 5,000 years before Christ, written records did not yet exist, but the silence left by texts was filled with symbols on cave walls. The cave paintings were like cosmic messages. Spirituality was expressed through spirals, geometric forms, and solar symbols. A civilization without calendars, but with a kind of astral map encoded in stone. And like every good story, this silence was hiding something that was about to emerge. As we approach 40,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens entered a new phase of spirituality, a phase where the invisible became experiential. Rituals of connection with other realities began to use substances like herbs, roots, teas, and mushrooms with hallucinogenic properties. These substances did not just generate visions, they triggered activations. They initiated a journey beyond matter, revealing that the spiritual was not just an idea, it was accessible. Our ancestors must have wondered, if a plant can bring me closer to the spiritual world, what other paths might be available? And thus, the instinct for survival began to share space with the thirst for transcendence. Today we know, as we will see later, through scientific and spiritual experiments, that these altered states of consciousness activate access to the quantum informational field, breaking the veil of matter and revealing the true nature of reality. Speaking again of pop culture, we have a ritual scene involving the so-called heart-shaped herb in the Black Panther movie, where an ancestral hallucinogenic plant takes the initiate to a higher plane of consciousness. Our ancestors also experienced visions that did not seem like hallucinations, but rather memories of something that had always been within them. And it was in this state of expansion that spirituality ceased to be just a suspicion and became an inner certainty. What was once merely intuition became perception. What was once instinct turned into revelation. The ancients began to feel, with their bodies, minds, and spirits, that something existed beyond the physical. From this, the first concepts of the soul, reincarnation, invisible worlds, and spiritual guides were born. Yes, these concepts were already present at the dawn of humanity. Some esoteric lines believe that, after the fall of Atlantis and the dispersal of the spiritual knowledge contained within it, this was the first step in humanity's reconnection with its spiritual purpose, a direct and irreversible experience, a portal that, once crossed, would never allow a return to ignorance, the path of the first initiates. Around 30,000 years ago, through these conclusions and experiences, Homo sapiens lived in a reality where everything was perceived as sacred. The cave paintings they left behind suggest a society deeply connected to nature and the sacredness of the feminine, which held a central role both spiritually and socially. And I know we usually think of that time as archaic and disconnected from reality, but chances are that, excluding the theory of Atlantis, this was the most enlightened period humanity has ever experienced on Earth. That era was marked by a belief system completely different from what would soon be implanted. At that time, there were no wars, dogmas, or separations. Only intuition, connection with the all, and the clear perception that the divine was not outside, but within. Some esoteric lines believe it was this foundation of consciousness that influenced everything that would come afterward, like an invisible root sustaining the tree of spirituality. It was in this environment that shamanism emerged, the first religious manifestation of humanity, still unnamed but already with the mission to guide, heal, and protect. The first shamans lived in all corners of the world, from Siberia to the Amazon, perceiving the planet as a living field of consciousness. The shaman was seen as a being with superior gifts, but his powers came from another dimension. His training or initiation involved a ritual with deep experiences that altered consciousness, with the goal of learning to interpret signs from the spiritual world. And even though this all may seem distant, much of what we know today as yoga practices, or even certain spiritual passages in biblical scriptures, have roots in these ancient rituals. The shaman was, above all, the first spiritual initiate. These initiates represented the first bridge between worlds. The first stage of initiation was symbolic death. The aspirant underwent fasting, isolation, and physical trials that broke his attachment to the body. In some tribes, even controlled torture was part of the process, while the rest of the tribe worried about the cold and hunting. There was someone sitting in the dark, meditating in silence, fasting, and speaking with spirits. That was a true original influencer. I don't know if you noticed, but what seems archaic was, in fact, an archetypal journey for the battle against the ego. Something that would only be fully explained and understood in its nuances many millennia later. Here we have the death of the ego for the recognition of the all. The second stage was the spiritual flight. In it, the initiate would visualize the tree of the three worlds, the realm of the living, the dead, and the spirits. Through trance, he would traverse the levels of reality and bring back visions of healing and wisdom. This symbol would become a reference in many future cultures. Consciousness would unfold and travel while the body remained still. It was the beginning of the interdimensional journey as a tool for connection and the pursuit of intuitive knowledge. The final stage was the mastery of the inner fire. The initiate learned to control his vital energy, especially sexual energy. Breathing, meditation, and self-control were used to transmute desire into enlightenment. The result was a state of pure creativity and spiritual expansion. By any chance, does that remind you of something? The first religion and its myths of human origin. The mastery of internal energy practiced by the shamans echoes precisely in the Eastern traditions we know today, especially when it comes to Kundalini energy. The control of body heat, breathing, and sexual energy is not exclusive to yoga. It already existed thousands of years before. Even the Bible suggests something similar, with the story of the three young men who survived King Nebuchadnezzar's furnace, which could symbolize the same principle. Some esoteric lines interpret connections in references to a cold fire, both in the Bible and in the Book of Enoch, for instance. A flame that does not consume but illuminates. What today seems to have emerged in famous doctrines may actually be the continuation of much older practices. And perhaps the true power does not lie in the names, but in the essence that perpetuates through time, changing its outer form, but not its soul. As we approach 5,000 years before Christ, a civilization arises that would record everything in writing in a more structured way. The Sumerians. They gave birth to the first city and the first organized religion in the world. For some obscure reason, their spiritual view was very different from shamanism. Their gods were numerous, imperfect, and full of quirks. They weren't seated on thrones judging humanity. They were at parties, in the streets, even committing excesses. They were like that uncle at Sunday lunch whom no one really knows why they still invite. Yet it was a living religion with rituals, exorcisms, amulets, and a belief in invisible forces. And it was in this same scenario that one of the most mysterious and impactful stories of hidden spirituality emerged, the myth of the Anunnaki. According to clay tablets discovered in Mesopotamia in 1848, an alien race came down to Earth with the goal of extracting gold for their home planet, and for this, they genetically manipulated primitive beings to create workers for them. This narrative, as fantastical as it may sound, raises questions that persist to this day. Why did humanity abandon its integrative and natural vision of the universe after the shamanic period? Were these beings responsible for the vibrational fall of our consciousness? In any case, the emergence of wars, disputes, and fear coincides with this transition. And the point is not to prove the existence of the Anunnaki, but to realize how a change in a civilization's beliefs can alter its entire destiny. From 1848 onward, the translations of the clay tablets sparked controversy. But it's undeniable that the myth of the Anunnaki appears in many other sources. The Atrahasis tablets, the Emerald tablets, the Book of Enoch, the Code of Hammurabi, the Dead Sea Scrolls. all speak of beings who came from the sky and are linked to the creation of humanity. When different cultures talk about the same thing with different names, maybe we are not dealing with a mere story, but with a memory. Quantum memory, morphic fields, or Akashic records, as we will see later, all refer to the same thing, something that remains alive even when lost, and someone is capable of bringing back that same information. So, if the Anunnaki truly existed, could these same beings have been responsible for the fall of Atlantis? Perhaps we will never know, but knowing how to ask the right question, Chosen One, may be more important than having all the answers. And if you think the mystery surrounding Sumerian accounts ends there, let me tell you about the Sumerian creation myth. It speaks of gods shaping man from clay and breathing life into his nostrils. Does that sound familiar? Exactly. The book of Genesis in the Bible repeats the same structure with different names and only a slightly different context. The same goes for the flood story. The Sumerians already had an account of gods angered by humanity, saving a single righteous man through a vessel, exactly the same as the story of Noah. This reveals a disconcerting truth. The Bible did not create these stories. It reinterpreted something much older. When we see these coincidences, we realize that the spirit behind the myths is the same. It's only the approach that changes. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the history of spirituality was never about separation. It has always been about reconnection. And the connections we are about to explore will leave you even more intrigued. The rise of Egypt as a spiritual power. Just 4 centuries after the Sumerians, along the banks of the Nile, not just a civilization arose, but a spiritual bridge between worlds. Ancient Egypt was much more than pyramids and mummification rituals. It was the cradle of universal spiritual wisdom. At its center was a figure shrouded in mystery, Hermes Trismegistus. Considered by the Egyptians to be a divine incarnation, he was also identified as Thoth, the god of wisdom, magic, and communication. Hermes didn't just record hidden laws, he decoded the functioning of the universe. It was applied spiritual science, which the ancients called Hermeticism. But Hermes' knowledge did not remain confined to Egypt. From Chaldea to Japan, from Persia to Greece, from China to Rome, and even India, his name and teachings echoed within the spiritual foundations of the world's most influential ancient civilizations. The influences of Hermeticism are literally everywhere. Even after centuries, Hermeticism never disappeared. It simply changed its outer form. It survived between the lines of nearly every secret order and sect, in the Kabbalah, in the symbolic formulas of alchemy, in the stained glass windows of cathedrals, in classical paintings immortalized over time, and even in the traces of sacred architecture across various countries. Symbols and references to Hermeticism are scattered across flags, corporate logos, and countless places. Even the newer religions could not escape it. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism all carry within their structures fundamental ideas originating from Hermeticism. The term occultism, which has become widely popular today, was coined by Hermes. Within Judaism, it is believed that even the patriarch Abraham learned many things about the universe directly from him. Hermes didn't found religions, he sowed codes. However, this wisdom was never made public. Hermetic teachings were reserved for a very select few. There were secret orders and sects that carefully chose their participants, and only those who had proven their worth gained access to this knowledge. Those who vibrated at the same frequency as truth. Perhaps, Chosen One, you are not here hearing this now by mere chance. In Egypt, and later in Greece, the the schools of occultism and magic emerged, forming the true awakened ones. It was not theoretical study. Nothing was memorized. Everything was lived. It was necessary to endure trials, to understand symbols, and to conquer inner silence. The temples of these secret orders were not just buildings. They were portals carved in stone, and those who passed through them came out changed, because they no longer saw the world the same way. Among the many legacies left by Hermes, one would transform into the most well-known, symbolic oracle in history, the tarot. It is said that Hermes condensed his knowledge into dozens of archetypal patterns, each scroll representing the hidden forces of the universe and the mythological cycles of the human soul. Later defined as cards, they were not merely symbols, but living formulas of communication and transformation. These original scrolls circulated within schools of occultism and magic and gave rise to what we now know as the major and minor arcana. Alongside this legacy, 7 laws stand out as a map to decipher the workings of reality. The law of mentalism. The all is mind. The universe is mental. The law of correspondence. As above, so below. The law of vibration. Nothing rests. Everything moves. The law of polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. The law of rhythm. Everything flows and ebbs. The law of cause and effect. Nothing happens by chance. And the law of gender. Everything has a masculine and feminine principle. These laws are not beliefs or commandments. They are mystical gears that drive everything that exists. Was Hermes and his advanced knowledge behind the mystery of the construction of Egypt's pyramids? Could it be that the knowledge he transmitted to Egypt at that time was even greater than what was recorded and has reached us? What could have been lost over these 7,000 years? The monotheistic seed and Egypt's echo. And if you, chosen one, thought that Egypt's spiritual influence ended with Hermeticism, it's time for us to move about 1,000 years forward on our timeline for yet another surprising contribution. A profound connection between Egypt and the 3 largest monotheistic religions on the planet: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yes, that's right. To understand this in detail, let's go back a few hundred years. This new part of the story begins once again in Sumer. It is there that we find Abraham, a member of a noble Sumerian family, living in the city of Ur, a Sumerian city, and receiving a divine calling to migrate to Canaan. It was the beginning of a journey that would forever change the course of Western spirituality. The call Abraham received led him to abandon polytheism and follow a more powerful God, probably the first idea of monolatry in history, a concept that would later evolve into monotheism. Although Abraham is often considered the father of monotheism due to his importance in the biblical narrative, historical findings conclude that another individual was actually the first to found a monotheistic religion, influencing Abraham's legacy, as we will see later. But who was Abraham's God? Esoteric theories suggest that Abraham may have carried with him a Sumerian deity, Enki, a Sumerian god considered superior and dual in nature, known for his wisdom and destructive impulses, for his light and shadow. This would explain the intense, sometimes severe and vengeful, sometimes merciful and benevolent personality of the God described in the Old Testament, the so-called God of Abraham. And if the very idea of a single God in Judaism did not originate directly with Abraham, but rather with the vision of following a superior deity from Sumer, how did this concept develop later? Stay with me in this video, and soon it will all make sense. After Abraham's death, his spiritual lineage continued through his son Isaac, and then his grandson Jacob. Jacob, also called Israel, had 12 sons, who would later give rise to the 12 tribes of Israel that formed the Hebrew people. One of these sons, Joseph, ended up being sold into slavery by his own brothers and was taken to Egypt. There, he rose to prestige, integrating into the Egyptian nobility and opening the doors for his entire lineage to settle in Egyptian territory. And it was precisely in this setting that generations later, another iconic figure in the history of global spirituality was born: Moses. Moses was raised as an Egyptian noble, having access to the best education, culture, and science of the time. His mind was shaped both by Hebrew blood and by Egypt's spiritual codes. Later, he would become the guide of the Hebrew people in the most iconic episode of Jewish tradition, the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, the journey to the Promised Land, and atop Mount Sinai, the reception of the 10 Commandments, a moment considered by many as the true birth of Western spiritual law. But the commandments received by Moses may have older echoes than we imagine. The so-called Judgment of Osiris, an ancient Egyptian tradition, included the 42 declarations of the righteous dead, confessions made in the presence of the gods. Among them, statements like, "I have not blasphemed, I have not stolen, I have honored my father and mother." Expressions that, centuries later, Moses would define as the commandments of Judaism. The moral structure was practically identical, but now reformulated for a new people, with a new spiritual mission. The similarity between the vows and the 10 Commandments is so striking that it becomes difficult not to theorize that everything was an adaptation. Moses converted these ancient precepts into a new spiritual code, adapting them to the context and language of his tradition. It's as if the same river of truth flowed through different beds, carrying the same water to new shores. The form changes, but the essence remains. And if the creation of the commandments was influenced by Egypt, even the concept of a single god accompanying them may have had an Egyptian source. The exact period and year of the events narrated in the Book of Exodus in Egypt are debated among historians, but the most traditionally accepted timeline shows a very close proximity between the reign of Akhenaten and the period Moses would have been born. During his childhood, Moses may have lived under the reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted to transform Egypt into a monotheistic nation. Akhenaten abandoned the pantheon of gods and instituted the worship of Aten, the symbol of the All. He even created a new capital and destroyed various records of polytheism. However, his spiritual revolution clashed with the interests of the Egyptian nobility. Esoteric theories claim that Moses absorbed these ideals from the revolutionary pharaoh, as his vision also resonated with the tradition inherited from his family lineage, bringing to the Hebrews the seed of Egyptian monotheism, even more refined and vibrant. If we add this to Abraham's tradition, his direct ancestor, we find the perfect fusion of Mesopotamian culture and Egyptian wisdom. And here, to enrich our history of spirituality even further, allow me to share a personal account of a spiritual experience. Because there's nothing more genuine for a video about the history of spirituality than something coming directly from another dimension. Not long ago, I attended a channeled lecture where a Brazilian spiritual master and medium named Helio Couto transmitted channeled messages from none other than Akhenaten himself. In this message, it was explained that Akhenaten's mission was to prepare the way for the arrival of Christ centuries later, making Egypt a land conscious of the presence and workings of the All. According to this channeling, the cult of Aten was a cultural reform, an attempt to awaken the people to the divine within and to the vision that the all is present in everything and everyone. This would be, according to Akhenaten, a great evolution in Egyptian spirituality, ensuring that the teachings that would later emerge with Jesus Christ in the year 0 had already begun in Egypt over 300 years earlier, something that would accelerate humanity's evolution. However, this revolutionary change threatened the political and economic interests of the elite at the time, leading to a conspiracy to bring about Akhenaten's downfall and, subsequently, a return to the old status quo. But this is merely a personal experience I share here for those who resonate with channeled information and who find meaning in the broader context we are working with. And returning to Moses within this scenario, it's possible that, witnessing all of this during his youth, Moses understood that the path of light needed another place to flourish. Perhaps his mission was to carry the knowledge of the all to a people who could receive and protect this spiritual truth. The Hebrews would then become one of the temples of light. And whether Moses actually had a divine revelation on Mount Sinai may not even be the central point. What matters most is understanding how, since the dawn of humanity, truth resurfaces, crosses kingdoms, languages, empires, and remains alive, even when forgotten or denied. Because what is eternal is never truly lost. It merely changes form. I personally believe that all these connections and turning points represent the struggle of light to elevate humanity's level of consciousness. And since we are speaking of ancient revelations, get ready. The next stage of our spiritual journey will take us to a place as powerful and influential in the history of spirituality as Egypt itself, where the sacred and the transcendental have intertwined for millennia. India, the spiritual awakening of India. If there's a place that carries within its soul the oldest traces of human spirituality, it's India. We now need to step back again in our timeline to around 3,000 years before Christ. Before the very idea of religions existed, the first civilizations of ancient India emerged in the Indus Valley. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were not just cities. They were centers of an organized, peaceful society, with no records of war, and featuring astonishing urban systems like sewage networks and harmonious constructions, an archaeological enigma, and a spiritual heritage. This absence of conflict and the level of social development point to something greater, a collective consciousness centered on the sacred. Like the shamanic peoples we saw earlier, these civilizations seemed to feel that nature was divine, that the invisible was present in everything. Were they the guardians of what remained from the spiritual vision of the first Homo sapiens? Was Hinduism born precisely to keep this unified perception of existence alive? One of the most intriguing findings was the ritualistic use of water, marking the first signs of spiritual purification through natural elements. And have you thought about which other religion also uses water in ritual? Exactly. It's curious to think that this ancient practice would become one of the central rituals of Christianity. Very soon, we'll talk in this video about newly discovered manuscripts that might explain how India could have even influenced the baptism of Jesus. In these same cities, the first signs of yoga were also found, but not the yoga of modern gyms. We're talking about the ancestral practice as it was conceived, a direct path to union with the divine. The most advanced technique among them would be Kriya Yoga, mentioned by masters like Krishna, Yogananda, and even Jesus. It is described as a tool capable of producing millennia of spiritual evolution for the practitioner within just a few hours. Its goal? To lead the practitioner to complete unification with the all. But how could something so complex and refined have emerged so many thousands of years ago? A possible explanation defended by some esoteric lines is that this refined and evolved knowledge was either inherited from Atlantis or transmitted by stellar beings. The Pleiadians, unlike the Anunnaki, who allegedly came to dominate, are said to have been spiritual guides who helped advance human consciousness. According to these theories, India was chosen to preserve and practice these millennia-old techniques. Hinduism would have become the sacred vault of interplanetary knowledge, left here to guide humanity back to its true origin. Returning now to the point we left off on the timeline, around 300 years before Christ, while Egypt was experiencing Akhenaten's revolution, India was entering its most sacred period, the Vedic period. It was then that the Vedas began to be recorded, ancient scriptures containing hymns, rituals, teachings, and philosophical visions about life and the divine. It was at this moment that the pillars of Hinduism were consolidated. Concepts such as dharma, the path of purpose, and karma, every action generates a reaction in the subtle field of existence, emerged. Karma does not punish, it merely reverberates. And it is here that the consciousness of energetic and spiritual responsibility starts to take shape within this tradition, not through imposition, but through direct connection to the functioning of the universe. This functioning is also subject to the cycle of samsara, the wheel of reincarnations. Unlike some doctrines that see reincarnation as linear evolution, here it is seen as a prison, the soul trapped in an endless cycle of rebirths without awakening. Therefore, the ultimate goal of the spiritual path is to break free from samsara and merge with Brahman, the All. It is the alchemical process of unification, which was already becoming clear to a yogi who lived over 1,000 years before Christ. This requires renouncing the illusion of the self and dissolving desires, attachments, and conditionings. Spiritual liberation is not the final prize of a moral staircase. It is the dissolution of the staircase itself. At the center of this Hindu cosmology is the Trimurti: Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. Three divine forces that make up the eternal cycle of the universe's existence. But here's a provocation. Christianity also speaks of a divine trinity. Could this Christian structure have been adapted from an even older tradition? Esoteric theories claim that after Rome adopted Christianity, many of Christ's original teachings were rewritten to appear unique. And what if he was actually teaching the same foundations as the Trimurti? In any case, the idea of beings embodying fundamental forces also resonates with the modern study of archetypes, as described by Carl Jung in the 20th century. Three principles that govern the metaphysics of the universe and manifest in different cultures, each in its own language, yet perhaps present across all eras. And if you feel fascinated by seeing how the truth is spread throughout all eras on Earth, comment, "I see the all in everything, since forever, the cosmic legacy of Persia." While India was consolidating its spiritual pillars, advancing 300 years on the timeline to around 1,000 or 900 years before Christ, a new spiritual force of great significance began to emerge in the region of ancient Persia. There, Zoroastrianism was born, the first spiritual tradition to record ideas such as paradise, resurrection, final judgment, and most importantly, the coming of a messianic figure who would save the world. Founded by Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, the prophet who reportedly received divine revelations after encounters with beings of light, this doctrine spoke of the eternal battle between light and darkness, between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. But the most revealing aspect was its focus on human choice. Every thought, every act, every intention influenced the fate of the soul after death. And my advice is, do not believe it is mere coincidence that this idea connects so closely to the Hermetic law of correspondence, as above, so below. And it was precisely here that the concept of the Saoshyant was born, the prophesied savior, a descendant of Zarathustra, who would be born of a virgin and come to restore harmony at the end of times. An archetypal story that much later the world would recognize as that of Jesus Christ. How is it possible that a concept so similar to the Christian savior already existed in a Persian religion many centuries before the New Testament? The answer may lie in the direct contact between the Hebrews and the Persians at a point in history when the Old Testament was still being written. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the Hebrew people by Babylon, around 580 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great, after defeating the Babylonians, liberated them and allowed the reconstruction of Jerusalem. It was during this period of coexistence and mutual influence that the biblical books containing the most messianic references began to be written, such as the Book of Isaiah, which was only completed after the Persian liberation, and within which we find some of the verses most attributed to the prophecies of a savior. This could be a strong indication of syncretism. At this point, Zoroastrianism may have left its deepest marks on Judaism, and consequently, on Christianity and Islam. The idea of a savior, final judgment, heaven and hell, all of this was already present in Persia, centuries before becoming popularized in the West, a cultural exchange that silently shaped the history of Western spirituality. Once again, we see distant doctrines sharing the same essence, and I believe that this is the greatest revelation so far, that divine information repeats itself in new forms, always trying to remind us of the truth. Want another example? One of the most powerful teachings left by Zarathustra is about the power of human choices and how they reverberate on the spiritual plane. Do you remember when we spoke about the influence of Hermes Trismegistus around the world? This principle of Zoroastrianism directly resonates with the Hermetic law of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The universe is not just a stage. It responds to what we project. Good and evil are not just moral concepts. They are vibrations that mold realities, the middle way and the non-theistic philosophy of the East. While the Hebrews were being freed from Babylonian captivity by Cyrus the Great, in India, one of humanity's most transformative spiritual figures emerged, Siddhartha Gautama. Born a prince, raised in absolute luxury and isolation, he had never seen pain, aging, or death. But upon encountering the reality of the world, something within him awakened. He abandoned his family, his wealth, and his title, and set out in search of the truth that would not only liberate himself, but all of humanity. During this journey, he experimented with various practices, including extreme fasting and long periods of mendicancy, until he understood balance was found in the middle, not in excess, nor in deprivation. Thus was born his principal philosophy, the middle way, a principle that directly echoes the Hermetic law of polarity, where wisdom lies in recognizing opposites and finding harmony between them. Siddhartha then sat beneath the Bodhi tree, vowing not to rise until he had attained the truth. After 49 days of deep meditation and confrontation with the illusions of Mara, the ego, the mind, fear, he reached awakening and became the Buddha. From that moment on, he spent 45 years teaching the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the Golden Rule. His teachings revealed that suffering has a cause, can be overcome, and that there is a path to do so. The focus was not on obeying a deity, but on recognizing the divine within oneself. This view is called non-theistic, and here it's important to clarify. It is not atheism. It does not deny the divine, but dissolves the separation between the human and the sacred. In Buddhism, there is no external God to be pleased, but an inner consciousness to be awakened. This revolutionary proposal would echo centuries later in the words of Jesus, "You are gods." And much later it would find support even in discoveries of modern physics, suggesting that the universe responds to the consciousness that observes it. Something intriguing that we will explore in more detail shortly. Thus, Buddhism represents one of the first expressions of a spirituality that does not wait, but acts, that does not worship, but lives divinity. And speaking of spirituality without an external deity, around the same time that Buddha lived in India, Lao Tzu was walking the lands of China. Author of the legendary Tao Te Ching, he founded a philosophy just as profound, Taoism. This tradition proposes that there is a natural flow to all things, the Tao, and that wisdom lies in flowing with it, not against it. Hence the principle of Wu Wei, action without effort, acting without struggle. Just as Buddha spoke about releasing control, Lao Tzu taught about not interfering with the dance of the universe. In Taoism, destiny is not created, it is accompanied. The highest symbol of Taoism, the yin and yang, represents the balance between polarities, light and dark, firm and soft, action and pause. Neither side is absolute, and both are necessary for the all to exist in harmony. This understanding directly connects once again to Hermeticism. Hermes Trismegistus's law of gender speaks of the masculine and feminine energies within everything that exists, and of the need to balance these forces to reach creative power. Thus, we realize how traditions that seem disconnected actually speak the same language of the soul. A wisdom that does not contradict itself, it only changes form. The East, then, was flourishing in its most refined expression of spirituality, silent, inward, self-sufficient. On one side, Buddha taught the cessation of suffering. On another, Lao Tzu pointed to the path of universal flow. It was also during this same period that two of the greatest spiritual works of the East emerged, the I Ching and the Bhagavad Gita. The first, from China, became the symbolic and philosophical foundation of Taoism, offering, through hexagrams, a map of life's movement in harmony with the Tao, a living oracle of wisdom. The second, from India, was revealed to Arjuna by Krishna, becoming one of the spiritual pillars of Hinduism, an epic synthesis of action, devotion, and transcendence, narrated on the inner battlefield of the soul, profoundly influencing Buddhism with its principles of detachment, self-mastery, and unity with the all. Both texts remain relevant even today, and are more than books. They are mirrors of the divine within the human. They reveal that, as I have already mentioned and emphasize again, even across different times and cultures, the same consciousness expressed itself in different garments. And maybe, just maybe, all this expansion of consciousness throughout the history of spirituality was already preparing Earth for the next great teaching in the spiritual saga. Because, as we will see next, one of the greatest spiritual forces in this story was about to be born, the hidden journey of Jesus. According to more recent historical and astronomical studies, the real birth of Jesus would have happened on September 8th and not on December 25th, as it became convention centuries later. This change of dates was promoted by the Roman Empire, which preferred to align Christ's birth with already traditional cultural festivities of that time of year. This simple adaptation raises suspicions about how many other modifications may have been made to the sacred narratives due to other interests of the Roman state, especially because If we look at Jesus' childhood as described in the Bible, we find almost absolute silence. Between his birth and his 30 years, practically nothing was officially recorded. But the detail is it wasn't due to a lack of existing records. The lingering question is, what is hidden behind this silence? The so-called official Gospels, compiled to form what we know today as the canonical Bible, practically ignore the youth of Jesus. Except for brief mentions like the flight to Egypt soon after his birth, due to Herod's persecution, everything else is a vast void. But the apocryphal Gospels, texts rejected by the Church, especially the infancy Gospel of Thomas, open a window to another side of this story. There, we see a young Jesus, already capable of extraordinary feats, mastering spiritual forces and manifesting both healings and acts of cruel power, revealing a controversial and questionable side. These stories were most likely considered dangerous for the institutionalized project of the Roman Church. Portraying a Jesus under construction, human and divine at the same time, might have gone against what they intended to propagate. It was between the ages of 12 and 30 that Jesus would have undergone intense spiritual formation and evolution. With this, we finally arrive at the time to reveal studies of recent discoveries known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These documents suggest that the Essenes, masters in spiritual science, astral projection, chakra understanding, and energy healing, would have sheltered and educated Jesus. The Essenes lived exactly in the regions of Egypt to which Jesus' family had fled. They believed in reincarnation and had an advanced understanding of the multidimensional nature of being. It would be no coincidence that Jesus would later demonstrate mastery over instant healings, control over matter, and a profound understanding of cosmic laws that only now, in the 21st century, are starting to find scientific explanations, a topic we will soon explore further in this video. This could also explain why the Church preferred to silence this occult side of Christ. An even more intriguing line of research indicates that, between the ages of 14 and 28, Jesus may have traveled to the east, seeking secrets still unknown in the West. Records from a Tibetan monastery speak of the presence of a holy Isa, Jesus' name in Islam, living in India, studying with prominent masters of Hinduism and Buddhism at the time. These texts recount his learning of techniques like deep meditation, energy healing practices, and a philosophy of direct contact with the divine, concepts entirely absent from Judaism at that time. There are even theories that Jesus learned practices, such as T-Dup Yang Bod, a precursor to Reiki. This quest for universal wisdom would shape his worldview as a Jew and his later work in his homeland. And it is at this point that we can understand his mission was not to create divisions, but perhaps to unite worlds. This hidden chapter of Jesus' life was detailed by Russian explorer Nicholas Notovich in the book The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, published in 1894. Initially ridiculed and slandered by the religious community of the time, the book nevertheless found support as more scholars presented similar records discovered in other Eastern traditions, causing major institutions to remain silent in an attempt to curb the spread of such information. According to Notovich, Jesus stayed in the Himalayas, absorbing teachings that resonate with his own teachings about compassion, detachment, and unconditional love. Seen from this perspective, we better understand why his parables and miracles resonate so deeply with Buddhist principles and contrast sharply with some Judaic precepts of the time. We can even understand baptism by water, so essential to Christianity, which traces back to ancestral practices we saw emerge in the Indus Valley. Thus, the historical Christ reveals himself, cosmic and universal, Upon returning to the West and being baptized by John the Baptist, Jesus began his public mission at the age of 30. His message? A profound fusion between the roots of Judaism and the highest mystical wisdom of the East, healing, teaching, challenging religious authorities. He brought a new code of life based on unconditional love, transcendence of the ego, and reconnection with the all. A true initiated master whose formation can no longer be seen solely through the lens of Judeo-Christian tradition, but as the result of a spiritual journey that crossed worlds and forever impacted the history of spirituality. His words, actions, and silences echo not merely as those of a prophet, but as the living awakening of the supreme consciousness on earth. After Jesus' death, Christianity, once heavily persecuted, would begin its definitive ascent in 312 AD, when Emperor Constantine claimed to have had a divine vision involving a symbol that combined Greek letters from Christ's name, called the Chi-Rho, promising victory if he used it. Constantine defeated his rival emperor Maxentius in a civil war, even though Constantine had a much smaller military force, and attributed the victory to the Christian God. Soon after, he began institutionalizing Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. This process consolidated basilicas, rituals, and structures much more aligned with Roman power than with the original essence of Jesus' teachings. A clear example that Roman manipulations of the essence of the teachings occurred is found in the record of the division of a group at the time called the Gnostics, who sought to preserve a deeper vision of Christian spirituality, but were marginalized and labeled as heretics by the Catholic Church. The Gnostics taught that the universe was an imperfect emanation of the All, designed to trap the divine spark within the human body, and that this spark could be freed through the development of intuitive knowledge about the spirit and the nature of reality. A very interesting vision, considering that they sought an interpretation of the essence of Christianity, something that resonates with the modern spirituality being revived in our contemporary times. With the fall of the empire and the collapse of the old order, the Middle Ages emerged. And although this period seems to have limited the evolution of spiritual history, the truth is that it wasn't exactly so. Silently, a crucial group for the future was flourishing, fearless, yet cautious. The alchemists, bringing new flames to the hidden knowledge, Islam, and the alchemy of the Middle Ages. But before we talk about the real meaning and contribution of alchemy in the history of Earth spirituality, let's advance a few centuries on the timeline, specifically to the 6th century, on the Arabian Peninsula, to talk about the birth of Islam, a monotheistic religion that, at its core, shares deep roots with Judaism and Christianity, revealing more similarities than differences. Muhammad, considered the last of the prophets, taught faith in a single God, called Allah. The Quran, his sacred book, reinforces principles of compassion, justice, and spiritual responsibility for the purification of the soul and the approach to the divine. Just like Jews and Christians, Muslims revere figures such as Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Among its most characteristic practices, like the emphasis on sacred law, Sharia, and traditional customs, are praying 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and strict observance of ethical and behavioral codes. This new spiritual force would vastly influence the world, and it would also be one of the responsible factors for expanding the scope of alchemy. When we talk about alchemy, most people still imagine it merely as experiments to turn lead into gold, or to seek immortality through the so-called philosopher's stone. However, true alchemy goes far beyond that. It already existed in Egypt around 200 BC, and also in Eastern cultures like the Chinese. But it was in the Middle Ages that alchemy evolved into a deeply spiritual practice, seeking the inner transformation of the human being. It can be said that the alchemists initiated the first historical union between science and spirituality, a work that, in a way, would only come close to completion now, with discoveries in physics in the 21st century. The spiritual development of medieval alchemy was widely influenced by various traditions: Muslim culture, Jewish Kabbalah, works like the Corpus Hermeticum, written between 100 and 300 AD, and the rise of Hermetic orders like the Rosicrucians expanded the alchemical vision beyond physical transformation. With the translation of Arabic texts and contact with Eastern philosophies, alchemy began to focus on the inner transformation of the human being. Matter became a symbol of the soul. This change elevated the alchemical practice into a path of self-knowledge and the quest for union with the all. The physical process became merely a mirror of the spiritual process. Just as Hermes Trismegistus had done in Egypt, the alchemists of the Middle Ages had to hide their knowledge in symbols and coded language. Being accused of heresy and witchcraft and suffering persecution by the Roman Catholic Church, especially during the Inquisition, they developed a Hermetic tradition where teachings were transmitted only to initiates. Every formula, every metaphor concealed profound spiritual secrets. Thus, alchemy consolidated itself as a true Hermetic order, guardian of ancient knowledge. Its goal was not merely material. It was the ascension of the human soul to the higher spheres of existence. In the 17th century, alchemy began to divide. On one side, the science that would give rise to modern chemistry. On the other, spiritual occultism. The esoteric part was forgotten, and physical transformation became the sole focus of official science. Isaac Newton himself, revered as one of the fathers of physics and mathematics, was also in fact a profound alchemist, a fact rarely disclosed. Newton conducted extensive research on theology, astrology, esoteric philosophies, occultism, and magic, and also made important interpretations of coded alchemical manuscripts from past centuries, trying to unite the laws of the cosmos with the laws of the spirit. Other great names like Francis Bacon, Paracelsus, Kepler, and even Robert Boyle, considered one of the founders of modern chemistry, also moved between science and mysticism. But official history chose to ignore this side. Francis Bacon, for instance, in one of his works titled New Atlantis, presented visions of how society should be, making a clear allusion to the city of Atlantis. In his vision, this utopian society would seek above all the knowledge of nature and the divine for the benefit of humanity, which resonates with alchemical, hermetic, and esoteric ideals of evolved societies from other planets and dimensions. And what was developed by alchemy during all these centuries of intense studies and hundreds of manuscripts recorded by the alchemists? Basically, it can be summarized as the study of human transcendence. The true treasure of alchemy was not physical gold, but the transformation of consciousness. The so-called Great Alchemical Work describes the inner process towards spiritual perfection. Each stage, calcinatio, solutio, coagulatio, sublimatio, mortificatio, separatio, and conjunctio, represents a phase of purification and integration of the being. Briefly summarizing each one, calcinatio is the pain and suffering that burns the ego. Solutio is the joy and love that dissolve emotional bonds. Coagulatio occurs when transformations materialize and incarnate into a new consciousness. Sublimatio elevates consciousness beyond worldly limitations, and mortificatio is the symbolic death of the old self. Separatio purifies the essential elements, preparing for supreme union. In the final stage, conjunctio, the fusion of opposites occurs. Conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine. Then emerges the symbolic figure of the alchemical androgen, the total, unified enlightened being. Therefore, we can conclude that the so-called Philosopher's Stone is not a literal object they sought materially. It is the symbol of the highest spiritual achievement. The individual, in a state of androgyny, could express through their total connection with all the ability to transmute reality itself through the expansion of consciousness. The alchemists did not seek chemical means to transform lead into gold. Rather, it would be achieved by the power of the mind of the unified individual, a conscious and complete co-creator, just as Jesus Christ was able to turn water into wine. This journey of transformation resonates deeply with traditions like yoga, Tantra, Taoism, and Kabbalah. It was also the foundation for Carl Jung's analytical psychology, which saw in alchemy the perfect symbolic description of the human individuation journey. Spiritual alchemy and its decoded knowledge encompass all areas of human action because it provides the answer to how the universe and life function. It is literally one of humanity's greatest spiritual secrets. For this reason, it left secret marks that survive through the centuries until today. Carl Jung, in particular, revealed how alchemical symbols represent archetypes of the human psyche. The alchemical quest for the integration of opposites is the same quest that moves the human being on their inner journey. Philosophers like Nietzsche, Hegel, or philosophies and branches of science like existentialism, quantum mechanics, and modern mysticism, all in some measure reflect this ancient wisdom. Alchemy, therefore, is much more than a historical curiosity. It is a detailed and profound map for the evolution of consciousness. And as we will see next, it was not only in Europe that deep evidence of Earth's spiritual history began to emerge. The spiritual peak of the Mayans and the witch hunts. While Europe evolved subliminally and secretly on the other side of the world in Central America, the Mayan Empire reached its peak between the 4th and 10th centuries AD. Emerging around 200 BC, the Mayans flourished without any known contact with other civilizations. Yet they present impressive synchronicities with Egypt. Among them, the construction of step pyramids with the same mystical symbolism and meaning, the worship of the serpent in the same ritualistic sense and even visually similar forms, the exact practice of cranial elongation to differentiate economic classes, and architectural representations of hybrid beings between humans and felines. These similarities are so specific that they raise theories about the inheritance from a common mother civilization, or even, according to some esoteric lines, suggest that mystical masters, whether from Egypt or the Mayans, mastered telepathy techniques, and that both civilizations exchanged information through mystical rituals. And there is yet another surprising possible coincidence that was discovered. 3 different scientists from the 19th and 20th centuries presented interpretations of a surviving Mayan manuscript post-Columbian invasions, known as the Madrid Codex, indicating that it describes Atlantis, its destruction process, and a date very close to the one reported by Plato in his manuscripts. Something impossible to be mere coincidence. A Greek account written around 360 years before Christ, finding validation on the other side of the planet in a Mayan manuscript dated around 1300 AD. Can you perceive the grandeur of this coincidence? Although the scientific community was quick to disparage and deny these interpretations with great effort, perhaps the reason is the profound impact such revelations would bring to the entire current belief system. What is your opinion on this? Coincidence? Concrete proof of ancestral memory? Or, as skeptical scientists defend, just pseudo-scientific conspiracy theories? Leave your opinion in the comments. The Atlantean hypothesis suggests that civilizations like Egypt and the Maya hold fragments of wisdom far older than what we have recorded, or even suggest extraterrestrial interventions like that of the Pleiadians. This would explain spiritual practices, advanced knowledge in astrology, architecture, and symbolic systems so similar, even though they emerged on separate continents and in different eras. A mystery that pulses like a living flame at the heart of humanity's spiritual history. A few hundred years later, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the official end of the Middle Ages. The modern age began, but contrary to what many imagine, it brought new forms of spiritual repression and control. Instead of light, humanity plunged deeper into darkness, disguised as material progress and imperial expansion. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, the brutal witch hunts took place, a true annihilation of ancestral feminine wisdom. The so-called witches were wise women, healers, midwives, keepers of nature's rhythms and subtle energies, who were persecuted, tortured, and killed. The church, driven by fear and the hunger to maintain political and financial monopoly, classified their practices as heretical and demonic. It was not just about heresy. It was about power, control, and silencing the true wisdom that flourished outside the cathedral walls. But this would soon mark the end of the church's oppressive era as we move a few years forward on our timeline. The age of spiritual revolt and the rediscovery of the occult. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg Castle, and with that gesture he initiated the Protestant Reformation, a movement that directly challenged the dogmas of the Catholic Church and denounced practices such as the sale of indulgences. The fragmentation of Christianity would deepen with the rise of new branches like Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and the Anabaptists. But what was at stake was far more than a religious clash. It was the prelude to a new era of intellectual and spiritual defiance. In parallel, the cultural renaissance was driving the rediscovery of human reason and classical knowledge. The ideas of freedom of thought were beginning to take root in European soil, and soon, the ancient spiritual wisdom that had been suppressed for centuries would begin to emerge once again. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, figures like Helena Blavatsky and Eliphas Levi reignited the flame of occult knowledge in the West. Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, merged Egyptian Hermeticism with the spiritual traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, proposing an integrated vision of universal wisdom. Levi, in turn, revived ancient high magic, Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism, restructuring modern occultism through works such as Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. Both were strongly influenced by the legacy of spiritual alchemy, whose essence had survived through the centuries. Although there is no historical confirmation of direct contact between them, the alignment of their studies suggests a mutual influence, direct or indirect. It was as if alchemy, Hermeticism, and the esoteric tradition were reborn in new bodies, ready to prepare human consciousness for leaps that, as we will soon see, would be even greater. During this same period, Allan Kardec organized what would become one of the most influential spiritual movements of the following centuries: Spiritism. Heir to a spiritual lineage connected to Celtic and shamanic traditions, Kardec proposed to unite science, philosophy, and religion under a new perspective. Studying mediumistic phenomena with methodological rigor, he codified the foundations of this new knowledge in 3 main works: the Spirit's Book, which establishes the philosophical foundations; the Medium's Book, which addresses techniques for communication with the spiritual plane; and the Gospel, according to Spiritism, which interprets Christ's moral lessons through the lens of soul evolution. More than a religion, Spiritism emerged as a new science of the soul, a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, between rational knowledge and eternal wisdom, with the flame of spiritual freedom reaching its peak in the 19th century. The figures of Helena, Eliphas, and Alan seemed to foresee that the next century would be the most revolutionary and impactful of all in the history of spirituality. It is in the 20th century that all the efforts made by humanity to keep the most essential spiritual teachings of Earth alive would finally begin to pay off. We arrive at the quantum era, and if you think this is only about technological advancement and the atomic bomb, in reality, you are about to witness an epic journey toward the definitive union of science and spirituality. And how, masterfully, scientists used the very system to spread this knowledge, something that brought a light of scientific understanding to all spiritual concepts and enabled us to comprehend the most fundamental mechanism of the universe and the all on a level never before possible. The 20th century and the rise of quantum spirituality. But even before we enter the 20th century, we need to go back to the previous one because it was there that the first timid step of quantum mechanics began. When Thomas Young performed the famous double-slit experiment, for the first time in 1801, he opened the first crack in the wall of classical materialism by demonstrating that light behaved like a wave and not just as solid particles. He was unknowingly preparing the ground for the greatest spiritual revolution disguised as science. It was as if nature was saying that the universe would not allow itself to be confined by rigid explanations, something that ancient shamanic masters and spiritual leaders of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even India had already intuited, but expressed in secret rituals, believing it to be the work of external gods. Soon the quantum era would reveal the power of our own consciousness in shaping reality. Then we arrive at the beginning of the 20th century. Max Planck and Albert Einstein didn't wait long, and in the first years of the 1900s, they laid more stones on this new path. Planck discovered the quantization of energy, and Einstein explained the photoelectric effect using light particles, photons, something that blew wide open the failure of classical materialist physics to explain the essence of the universe. In 1913, Niels Bohr defined the atom as we know it today, already illuminated by quantum physics, showing that even atoms didn't behave as expected by classical physics. Reality seemed to jump between states, as if obeying an invisible logic. Physics was unknowingly beginning to rediscover the presence of the divine. But everything was still wrapped in technical language, without daring to name it as such. Several experiments followed, and the entire scientific community was stunned by the findings. But one thing intrigued them the most. Quantum systems of atoms and particles like electrons only seemed to become matter when observed by someone. It was as if there were an instant communication between the mind of the observer and the matter of the universe. This was the first sign that our consciousness plays a fundamental role in the existence of the reality we observe. It was in the 1920s, during an explosion of theories and philosophical debates about the meaning of these discoveries, that the division became clear. Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, founders of the mathematical principles of quantum mechanics, decided to gather the most prominent scientists and physicists of the time and formalized what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, affirming that the act of observing matter indeed alters its outcome. But instead of diving into the philosophical consequences of this fact, they chose to treat it as a simple calculation rule. It was like saying, "It's better if we don't focus on what this all means. Let's just calculate and explore it pragmatically." Most of science then chose to close its eyes to the mystery and focus on the math and technological applications, while a smaller, quieter but powerful group began the true pursuit. If reality depends on the observer, what is the role of consciousness? That question would change everything. During the 1940s, two giants began dissolving the boundary between physics and psyche. Wolfgang Pauli, Nobel Prize winner in physics, joined forces with none other than Carl Jung to study the mind and the mystery of synchronicity. Meanwhile, Schrödinger, also a Nobel laureate, wrote the book, What is Life? Recognizing that the mystery of particles and biology itself required the existence of something beyond matter. If since the first civilizations of the Indus Valley, up to the consolidation of Christianity by the Roman state, people had spoken of a vital and divine force connecting everything, now modern science was beginning to describe the same principle, using the language of mathematics. Let me summarize the concept for you. Quantum physics revealed that the universe may have multiple dimensions and a spiritual realm, what physicists call non-local. Matter is vibrational. It behaves both as wave and particle at the same time, meaning it plays a game of being energy, and at times, becoming actual matter. While it remains as energy, it holds infinite possibilities for how it might manifest into matter, and what determines how and when it manifests: the presence of someone observing it. Additionally, physicists discovered that for this dynamic to work, there must exist what they called the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is an ocean of pure energy, present throughout the entire universe, from which all matter emerges and to which it remains connected. Everything comes from the quantum vacuum and stays in constant interaction with it. If we zoom into your body down to the cells, and then deeper into atoms and particles, we eventually reach the quantum vacuum. Does this concept remind you of anything? What physicists began to realize, and what made many of them retreat into pure mathematics, was that it was impossible for the quantum vacuum to lack consciousness or intelligence. The mathematics of quantum physics points to this. It's as if it were omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Albert Einstein criticized the idea of embracing a purely random or probabilistic interpretation of these experiments with a phrase that would become famous: God does not play dice with the universe. The second half of the 20th century witnessed a true explosion in the investigation of consciousness. American Jose Silva created a specific and effective method for mental expansion, developing reasoning, learning, and extrasensory skills, training brainwave states that yogis millennia earlier would have called samadhi states. Robert Monroe, meanwhile, went even further. He founded the Monroe Institute and empirically proved that consciousness could move beyond the physical body to experience out-of-body journeys. In the context of the Cold War, all these studies, and the suspicion that the Soviet Union was investing in paranormal and psychic research for espionage, led the United States to launch a secret program, Project Stargate. For 25 years, the military and the CIA investigated and employed individuals with psychic abilities like remote viewing supported by quantum physics, showing that even though consciousness theories were under criticism, they were already being considered. Starting in the 1970s, mystical and spiritual interpretations of quantum mechanics gained broader popularity and reached other fields. Respected physicist Fritjof Capra was one of the pioneers in extensively connecting relativity theory, quantum mechanics, and Eastern mystical traditions in his best-selling book, The Tao of Physics, which broke academic walls by showing that the subatomic dance of reality mirrored the flow of the Tao, described in Taoism by Eastern masters more than 500 years before Christ. Isn't it fascinating to realize that wisdoms which seem so distant, not only by time but by nature, are actually intrinsically connected? In the 1980s and 90s, another major physicist, David Bohm, Nobel nominee and student of Oppenheimer, proposed the theory of the implicate order, explaining how the visible universe emerges from a hidden dimension of pure consciousness. Bohm had the courage to formulate and publish a complete theory that stated, "We are all the all," validating millennia of humanity's spiritual wisdom. Brian Josephson and Eugene Wigner, both Nobel Prize-winning physicists, further elevated the discussion of mind-matter phenomena and the paranormal. Rupert Sheldrake brought forth a revolutionary and daring theory that may explain how the soul, or spirit, accumulates information over time and incarnations. All of them were working from the premise that consciousness and matter are not separate. The movement continued to build momentum. Year after year, countless related books were published, the field of computer science developed, and neuroscience began to emerge, bringing new research already linked to quantum concepts. By the early 21st century, it was another Nobel laureate, Roger Penrose, who offered an explanation for how consciousness manifests at a fundamental level in the brain. As more and more scientists and physicists embraced spiritual and mystical interpretations of quantum mechanics, the scientific community, still clinging to centuries-old paradigms, coined the term quantum mysticism, in an attempt to discredit those who chose to face quantum mechanics with scientific honesty, rather than limiting themselves to equations. But it would be in 2004 that what I consider the last great milestone in the spiritual history of Earth, at least in this video, would occur. The holistic and complete vision of the universe broke out from a restricted niche into the mainstream with the theatrical release of the documentary film, What the Bleep Do We Know? Have you seen this film? Tell me in the comments. The small independent project, with no major studios behind it, gathered a group of respected scientists and physicists and showed the world that consciousness shapes reality, openly connecting quantum physics with spirituality, religion, and philosophy. Its theatrical debut was modest, with a very low budget and only a few screenings in the United States. But word of mouth and public response turned What the Bleep Do We Know into a massive success, staying in theaters for months across several countries, and even up to 9 months in some cities. It was a clear sign the world was ready and hungry to accept that the divine is not just a belief, but an active, measurable force that permeates all that exists. If you haven't watched this historical narrative yet, I can tell you it's a must-see. Besides, What the Bleep Do We Know? Only one other comedy film in cinematic history has achieved a similar feat in terms of time spent in theaters. Finally, the 20th century was so special for spirituality that, beyond quantum mechanics, we had many figures who left a lasting mark on this era. And I'd like to give an honorable mention to 3 of them. The first is Osho, a figure who challenged hypocritical moralism and brought meditation to the West as a living, transformative practice. He left behind a vast legacy of transcribed books for humanity, where Osho synthesizes and refines millennia of spiritual wisdom. Then there's Paramahansa Yogananda, who, with his autobiography of a yogi, revealed to the world the fantastic and ancient practice of Kriya Yoga, rescuing what may be the most powerful and efficient enlightenment technique on Earth, a true lost link between action, devotion, and transcendence. And finally, Mahatma Gandhi, who proved that the application of authentic spirituality can move entire nations. Gandhi sparked deep reflection around the world by demonstrating his power of co-creation in liberating a people, without the need to hold any official position of power. He showed us that true power lies within each of us. Each of them, like distinct beams of light, reflected the same eternal truth. Spirituality is not a dogma. It is a state of being. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Know that you are now among the few human beings who possess a complete vision of the history of spirituality. Comment below. I remembered the whole story so that I can personally recognize and honor your level of dedication in seeking a deeper understanding. Throughout this journey, we've seen that the history of human spirituality is like an underground river flowing through civilizations, languages, and eras, always guiding those willing to hear its silent call. The truth, though camouflaged beneath symbols, religions, secrets, and scientific theories, has never stopped pulsing for those bold enough to look beyond appearances. Modern science and ancient wisdom, far from contradicting each other, reveal themselves as two sides of the same quest, the rediscovery of our eternal connection with the All. If spirituality is the spark, science is the mirror, and the awakened being is the one who recognizes that both reflect the same infinite. The history of spirituality does not end here. It simply returns to its true point of origin, within us. And remember, you're not here to find a purpose. You are the purpose, experiencing itself. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope this content has deeply impacted you and resonated directly with your soul's memory. A life of infinite possibilities awaits you.